You have come here because something in you already knows that the word dangerous has very little to do with aggression, domination, or overt power. When I speak of the most dangerous empath, I am not referring to someone who wounds others deliberately, nor to someone who seeks revenge, triumph, or moral superiority. I am speaking of a psychic configuration that emerges only after a long descent, one that most empaths never complete because it requires the loss of what once defined them. It is a stage of consciousness in which the familiar reflexes of empathy, explanation, repair, and emotional accommodation have fallen away, not through bitterness, but through a deeper alignment with the self. I have called this kind of moment an individuation crisis, though the word crisis is misleading, for it often arrives not with drama, but with a profound and unsettling calm. Again and again, in my patients, I saw that the empath begins life oriented outward. Their psychic energy flows instinctively toward the emotional states of others. They feel before they think, they respond before they choose, and they adapt before they understand. This is not weakness, it is an archetypal configuration rooted in the anima principle of relatedness, receptivity, and psychic permeability. Yet what is archetypal is also dangerous when it remains unconscious. An empath who has not differentiated ego from unconscious participation becomes a vessel for projections. They carry the unlived lives of others, the denied shadows of families, lovers, groups, and entire cultures. In my work on the structure of the psyche, I observe that such individuals often mistake this burden for virtue. They believe their suffering is proof of goodness, their endurance proof of love, but there comes a point, and not all reach it, where the unconscious withdraws its support for this arrangement. The empath begins to feel an unfamiliar resistance inside. What once flowed automatically now requires effort. Compassion becomes tiring. Understanding others no longer feels ennobling, it feels hollow. This is not pathology. It is the psyche announcing that a one-sided attitude has reached its limit. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. When a conscious attitude becomes too moral, too identified with goodness, the unconscious compensates with exhaustion, resentment, and ultimately withdrawal. The Sophia Stage, as it is often named symbolically, does not emerge from rage or collapse, but from this withdrawal. Sophia, in the language of the psyche, is not sentiment, she is wisdom embodied, the union of eros and logos, feeling and discernment, love and boundary. She does not rush towards suffering, she stands in relationship to it. When an empath enters this stage, they do not become colder in the emotional sense, but they become less available to unconscious demand. This is the moment that others experience as dangerous, because the empath is no longer predictable. In the earlier stages, the empath can be wounded, exploited, misunderstood, yet still remains psychically open. They explain themselves endlessly. They translate their inner truth into softer language so that others will not feel threatened. They absorb blame that does not belong to them, believing that harmony is always preferable to truth. But in the Sophia stage, something decisive happens. The ego steps back from its compulsive identification with being needed. The self moves forward as the organizing center. Silence replaces explanation, not as a tactic, but as a natural consequence of inner authority. Again and again in my patients, I saw how shocking this shift was to those around them. People are accustomed to interacting not with the person, but with the role. The empath has been the container, the listener, the emotional interpreter. When that function dissolves, the surrounding psyche panics, projections intensify, accusations appear, the empath is suddenly called selfish, cold, arrogant, even cruel, yet none of these names truly fit. What others are encountering is not hostility, but psychic opacity. The empath no longer offers their interior world as a public resource. This is why I say this stage is dangerous. It destabilizes unconscious contracts. Many relationships are not built on mutual recognition, but on invisible agreements. I will feel for you what you cannot feel yourself. I will carry what you refuse to carry. I will soften reality so you do not have to face it. When the empath reaches Sophia, these agreements are broken without confrontation. There is no dramatic declaration. There is simply a quiet refusal to continue. And because the refusal is not explained, it cannot be negotiated. I have called this the moment when the ego finally aligns with the self rather than with the collective expectation. The empath no longer asks, "How will this affect them?" as the primary question. Instead, a deeper question emerges, often without words. Is this in alignment with my inner truth? This is not narcissism, though it is often labeled as such by those who benefited from the old arrangement. Narcissism inflates the ego at the expense of relationship. Sophia integrates the ego into a larger order, one that includes relationship but is not ruled by it. In dreams that accompany this stage, certain symbols appear with remarkable consistency. Water becomes still rather than turbulent. Doors close without violence. Animals that once appeared wounded or dependent now stand at a distance. Watching, the dream ego no longer rushes to intervene. There is often an image of elevation, not as triumph, but as perspective, a hill, a tower, a shoreline seen from above. These images do not suggest superiority, but separation. Consciousness has differentiated itself from unconscious fusion. Most empaths never reach this stage because it demands the death of an identity that once felt sacred. To move into Sophia, the empath must tolerate being misunderstood without rushing to correct the misunderstanding. They must endure guilt without immediately resolving it. They must allow others to suffer the consequences of their own unconsciousness. This is extraordinarily difficult for a psyche trained in relational rescue. Many retreat at this threshold, choosing familiar suffering over unfamiliar wholeness. But when the threshold is crossed, something irreversible occurs. The empath's presence changes. They speak less, yet their words carry weight. They do not chase connection, yet others feel their absence acutely. They no longer argue for their reality, and precisely for this reason, it becomes undeniable. This is the paradox of the Sophia stage. By withdrawing psychic energy from the field of projection, the empath becomes a mirror rather than a container. Others are forced to encounter themselves. I once wrote, in essence, that what we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. The Sophia stage empath ceases to be fate for others. They step out of that role, and in doing so, they become dangerous to every structure that relied on their unconscious participation, not because they attack it, but because they no longer hold it together. This is only the beginning of what unfolds at this stage. The deeper implications reach into shadow, sacrifice, and the final transformation of Eros itself. The danger deepens when we recognize that Sophia does not merely withdraw energy from others, she reorganizes the inner hierarchy of the psyche itself. In earlier stages, the empath's ego is ruled by an unconscious moral imperative to alleviate suffering, to maintain harmony, to be emotionally available at all costs. This imperative often masquerades as conscience. Yet, it is frequently nothing more than a complex formed through early adaptation. The child learns that safety depends on attunement, that love is earned through understanding, that conflict threatens belonging. Over time, this adaptation hardens into identity. The empath does not merely behave empathically, they believe they are empathy itself. In my work on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, I observed that when an identity becomes too tightly bound to a single function, the psyche seeks balance through disruption. The Sophia stage is such a disruption, but it arrives with a strange dignity. The empath does not collapse, they simplify. They no longer feel compelled to justify their inner movements. Choices arise from a quieter place, one that does not argue with itself. This is often mistaken for detachment, yet it is more accurately described as inner cohesion. At this point, the shadow undergoes a critical transformation. In the earlier empathic configuration, aggression, refusal, and self-prioritization are banished into the shadow. They are judged as immoral or dangerous, and thus they return indirectly through resentment, exhaustion, or psychosomatic symptoms. In the Sophia stage, these shadow elements are no longer repressed. They are integrated not as brutality, but as firmness. The empath discovers that saying no does not require cruelty, and that boundaries do not require explanation. This discovery alone radically alters their psychic field. Again and again in my patients, I saw that those around the empath reacted more strongly to this firmness than they ever did to overt conflict. Conflict invites engagement, firmness ends it. There is nothing to argue with, nothing to persuade. The Sophia stage empath does not withdraw in anger, nor do they punish with silence. They simply cease to overfunction emotionally. The psyche of the other, deprived of its accustomed support, begins to unravel its own defenses. This is why accusations escalate at this stage. The other feels abandoned, even betrayed, though no promise was ever made. Here we touch the archetypal core of Sophia. Wisdom is not sentimental. She does not confuse love with sacrifice, nor truth with accommodation. In the symbolic language of the psyche, Sophia stands beside the self as a mediating figure, translating unconscious depth into conscious order. When the empath enters this stage, eros is no longer diffused indiscriminately. It becomes selective, oriented toward what is real rather than what is merely needy. This selectivity feels threatening in a world accustomed to emotional availability without cost. There is often a period of profound solitude that accompanies this transition. Not loneliness, but solitude. The empath finds that many connections fall away without confrontation. Conversations feel repetitive, shallow, or subtly coercive. The psyche refuses to participate. This solitude is not a punishment. It is an incubation. The self is consolidating authority. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. Individuation requires separation, and separation is always experienced by the collective as betrayal. Dreams during this period frequently contain images of pruning, shedding, or winter landscapes. Trees stand bare yet alive. Houses are emptied of unnecessary rooms. Old companions disappear without explanation. These are not images of loss, but of concentration. Psychic energy is being withdrawn from dispersion and gathered inward. The empath is no longer living in reaction to the emotional weather of others. They are learning to inhabit their own inner climate. Most never reach this stage because it demands a radical trust in the unconscious. The empath must allow relationships to end without repairing them, misunderstandings to persist without clarification, and projections to remain uncorrected. This feels almost immoral to a psyche trained in emotional responsibility. Yet it is precisely this restraint that allows the self to emerge as the guiding principle. The empath ceases to be a moral worker for the collective and becomes instead a psychological presence. This presence has a peculiar effect. Others sense it immediately, though they cannot name it. There is less warmth, perhaps but more gravity, fewer words, but greater consequence. The empath is no longer transparent. Their interiority is not offered up for inspection or reassurance. This opacity forces a confrontation with one's own unconscious. Some are drawn toward it with fascination, others recoil in hostility. The reaction is rarely neutral. I have called this the moment when the individual steps out of the mother archetype unconsciously and into wisdom consciously. The empath is no longer the emotional womb for others' undeveloped selves. They no longer metabolize pain on behalf of those who refuse to suffer consciously. This refusal is what makes them dangerous, for it exposes the immaturity of the surrounding psychic field. Systems, families, and relationships that depended on emotional asymmetry begin to destabilize. It is important to understand that this stage is not chosen in the way one chooses a strategy. It is endured. The empath does not wake up one day and decide to become dangerous. They are pushed to the edge by exhaustion, by the quiet despair of endless understanding without recognition. When the psyche can no longer sustain the imbalance, it withdraws libido from the old patterns. What emerges is not hardness, but alignment. There is often grief here, though it is rarely acknowledged. The empath grieves the loss of their former innocence, the belief that love alone could heal, that understanding could redeem any situation. This grief is subtle, almost private. It does not seek consolation. It is the mourning of a myth, and myths do not die easily. Yet once mourned, they release immense energy. The empath no longer lives inside a story that requires self-erasure. From this point onward, relationships are chosen rather than endured. The empath no longer confuses intensity with intimacy, nor suffering with depth. They are capable of great closeness, but it is reciprocal, grounded, and bounded. They listen without absorbing, care without dissolving, love without disappearing. This is what I mean when I say that the most dangerous empath is the one who has reached Sophia, not because they dominate, but because they cannot be dominated unconsciously. What follows from this stage is not withdrawal from life, but a different participation in it. The empath becomes less visible in certain ways, yet more real. They are no longer easily categorized. They do not signal virtue. They do not perform healing. Their presence itself becomes a challenge, for it invites others to take responsibility for their own psychic lives. This is why the Sophia stage remains rare. It demands courage of a quiet kind, the courage to stand without reassurance, to act without applause, to live without constant relational confirmation. It demands fidelity not to ideals, but to the inner voice that does not shout. And once this fidelity is established, there is no return to the old economy of self-sacrifice. The empath who reaches this stage does not announce it. There is no badge, no transformation narrative, no public reckoning. There is simply a shift in gravity. Words fall away, explanations end. Life reorganizes itself around a deeper center, and those who were once most comfortable in the empath's presence are often the first to feel unsettled, for something essential is no longer being carried for them. This is not an ending, it is a crossing, and beyond it, the work of the self continues, deeper, quieter, and far less visible to the outer world. As this crossing stabilizes, the psyche enters a phase that is far less dramatic than the threshold itself, yet far more consequential. The empath who has entered Sophia does not remain in perpetual withdrawal. What changes is not their capacity for relationship, but the axis around which relationship turns. No longer is the other the gravitational center. The self has taken that place, and with it comes a new internal law that is not moralistic, not idealistic, but factual. What aligns remains, what does not falls away without hostility. I observed repeatedly that after this shift, the empath's perception sharpens in a way that unsettles others. They see patterns immediately, not because they analyze more, but because they are no longer invested in illusion. When one is no longer dependent on being liked, needed, or approved of, perception becomes clear. One sees where words do not match actions, where affection masks control, where intimacy conceals dependency. This clarity is not weaponized. It does not need to be spoken, yet it is felt, and this, more than anything, is why others experience the Sophia Stage empath as dangerous. In earlier stages, the empath softened what they saw. They translated it into gentler language, excused it through empathy, or took responsibility for it themselves. Now they do none of these things. They simply do not participate in the distortion. When confronted with manipulation, they do not accuse, they disengage. When faced with emotional pressure, they do not resist. They remain unmoved. This neutrality is often interpreted as cruelty, yet it is neither warm nor cold. It is exact. Here the archetype of the wise old woman or wise old man begins to constellate. Regardless of biological age, wisdom, in the Jungian sense, is not knowledge but proportion. It is the ability to give each thing its proper weight. The Sophia Stage empath no longer overweights the emotions of others at the expense of their own psychic integrity, nor do they swing to the opposite extreme of indifference. They respond according to reality, not according to demand. This reorientation has profound consequences for the unconscious of those around them. People unconsciously test the empath, escalating behavior that once elicited engagement. They dramatize, provoke, guilt, seduce, or withdraw, hoping to reactivate the old pattern. When this fails, anxiety rises. The other senses that something essential has been lost, yet cannot articulate what it is. The empath has ceased to be a psychic regulator. Each individual is returned to themselves. I have called this elsewhere a moment of psychic emancipation, not freedom from relationship, but freedom from unconscious bondage. Yet emancipation is rarely welcomed by those who benefited from dependency. The Sophia Stage empath becomes a mirror that no longer distorts, and most people do not wish to see themselves clearly unless suffering has already driven them to it. At this stage, the empath's own shadow continues to refine itself. Aggression is no longer split off, but neither is it acted out. It becomes discernment. Desire becomes choice rather than compulsion. Compassion becomes voluntary rather than reflexive. The empath may still feel deeply, but feeling no longer dictates action. This is a crucial distinction. Feeling informs, it does not command. Dreams now shift again. The earlier images of pruning and solitude give way to symbols of orientation compasses. Paths through unfamiliar terrain. Light sources that do not illuminate everything but enough. There is often a sense of traveling alone yet not being lost. These dreams indicate that the ego has accepted guidance from the self without demanding certainty. Life is approached as a process rather than a problem to be solved. Many mistake this phase for emotional numbness, yet if one looks closely, one sees that the empath feels more accurately than before. What has disappeared is not emotion, but excess emotion generated by unconscious identification. The empath no longer absorbs what does not belong to them. As a result, their inner life becomes simpler, quieter, and paradoxically richer. Energy once spent on emotional labor returns to creativity, contemplation, and meaningful action. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. When libido is withdrawn from false adaptation, it does not vanish, it transforms. The Sophia Stage empath often experiences a resurgence of interests long abandoned, a return to symbolic thinking, art, study, or spiritual inquiry. These are not escapes from relationship, but expressions of a psyche no longer consumed by maintenance. Relationships that do survive this transition deepen in an entirely different way. There is less intensity, less drama, but far greater truth. Conversations no longer revolve around reassurance, explanation, or emotional negotiation. Silence is tolerated, difference is allowed, each person carries their own psychic weight. Such relationships feel strangely light, even when they touch difficult material, because they are not burdened by unconscious exchange. It is here that we must understand why the Sophia stage cannot be taught, imitated, or accelerated. It is not a mindset, it is an outcome of lived psychic necessity. Those who attempt to perform it prematurely often become rigid, defensive, or moralistic. True Sophia has no need to prove itself. It does not posture as strength, it simply is. The empath who has reached this stage often becomes less visible to the collective eye. They no longer signal their inner state, they do not narrate their process. This invisibility can feel disorienting at first, especially for those who once received validation through being seen as kind, understanding, or special. Yet this anonymity is liberating. The psyche is no longer split between who one is and how one is perceived. From the outside, little may seem to change. The empath may still care, still listen, still participate, but the internal economy is entirely different. They are no longer paying for belonging with self-erasure, they belong to themselves first. And from that belonging, they can meet others without fear. This is why the most dangerous empath is not the wounded one, nor the angry one, nor even the enlightened one in the popular sense. It is the one who has made peace with not being needed. Such a person cannot be controlled through guilt, praise, or threat of abandonment. They have already faced abandonment internally and survived it. Most will never reach this stage because it requires a willingness to disappoint others without resentment and to disappoint oneself without despair. It requires enduring the liminal space where old identities no longer function and new ones have not yet formed. It requires trusting that meaning does not disappear when roles dissolve. And so the Sophia stage empath walks differently through the world, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a quiet alignment that cannot be negotiated away. They no longer ask permission to exist as they are. They no longer explain their boundaries. They simply live from a deeper center, and in doing so, they quietly rearrange every space they enter. This is not the end of individuation, but it is a decisive passage. Beyond it, the psyche no longer seeks to be good in the eyes of others, it seeks to be whole. When this wholeness begins to govern the psyche, a subtle but profound shift occurs in how time itself is experienced. The empath who has entered Sophia no longer lives in constant anticipation of relational repair or future reconciliation. In the earlier stages, much psychic energy was bound to the hope that things would eventually be understood, resolved, redeemed. Time was unconsciously oriented toward an imagined moment of mutual recognition. In Sophia, this orientation dissolves. Life is no longer postponed until others change. The present moment becomes sufficient, not because it is pleasant, but because it is real. I observed repeatedly that this change in temporal orientation unsettles those who remain caught in unconscious expectation. They sense that the empath is no longer waiting, not waiting to be chosen, not waiting to be understood, not waiting for permission. This creates a peculiar asymmetry. The other may still live in a future-oriented fantasy of repair, while the Sophia stage empath has already integrated loss. And once loss has been integrated, it can no longer be used as leverage. This is one of the least understood dangers of the Sophia stage. The empath becomes immune to promises. Hope, which once bound them to dysfunctional dynamics, no longer functions in the same way. This does not mean they become hopeless. On the contrary, their hope relocates. It is no longer invested in people's potential as imagined by the ego, but in the self's capacity to generate meaning regardless of outcome. This shift alone breaks countless unconscious bonds. Here the anima itself undergoes a refinement. In its earlier form, anima expresses itself as longing, merging, idealization. The empath feels drawn toward emotional intensity, toward souls that seem wounded, complex, or unfinished. In Sophia, anima no longer seeks completion through the other. She becomes an inner guide rather than an external magnet. Relatedness remains, but it is no longer fused with salvation fantasies. Love ceases to be redemptive and becomes truthful. This transformation often brings with it a strange compassion, one that does not rush forward. The empath can witness suffering without immediately intervening. This capacity is frequently misunderstood as coldness, yet it is in fact a deeper respect for the autonomy of the other's psyche. I have called this respect a form of psychic ethics. One does not interfere with the individuation of another, even when that individuation involves pain. Again and again in my patients, I saw how difficult this ethical stance was to maintain. The temptation to rescue, to explain, to soften remains strong, especially when old relational patterns reassert themselves. Yet each time the empath resists this temptation, something consolidates internally. The ego learns that it can survive disapproval. The psyche learns that love does not require self-abandonment. Gradually, an inner solidity forms that no longer depends on external confirmation. At this point, the shadow of the empath reveals its final lesson. Earlier, the shadow contained aggression, selfishness, and refusal. Now it reveals something subtler, the fear of power. Many empaths unconsciously fear their own authority. They associate power with domination, cruelty, or narcissism, often because they have been wounded by those who wielded power unconsciously. In Sophia, this fear must be confronted. Authority is reclaimed, not as control over others, but as authorship of one's own life. This is why the Sophia stage empath often becomes strangely ungovernable. They are not rebellious. They do not resist rules for the sake of resistance, but they cannot be moved by pressure that contradicts their inner law. Appeals to obligation, loyalty, or moral duty lose their force if they violate psychic truth. This ungovernability is deeply threatening to hierarchical systems built on emotional compliance. Dreams at this stage sometimes feature images of judges, scales, or ancient laws, not laws imposed from outside, but laws discovered. There is often a sense that something older and deeper than personal preference is at work. The dream ego may be tasked with guarding a threshold, weighing something precious, or declining entry to those who are unprepared. These images reflect the psyche's recognition that not all access is earned, and not all intimacy is deserved. Most empaths have been taught, implicitly or explicitly, that withholding access is immoral. Sophia overturns this belief. She teaches that discernment is not rejection, and that boundaries are not punishments. They are structures that allow meaning to endure. Without structure, eros dissipates. Without limits, love becomes exhaustion. As this understanding stabilizes, the empath's communication changes further. They speak less about their inner world, not because it has diminished, but because it no longer seeks validation. Words become functional rather than confessional. When they speak, it is because something true needs to be said. not because something painful needs to be shared. This shift alone radically alters how others relate to them. The empath is no longer emotionally transparent, and thus no longer easily readable or usable. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. The individuated person becomes symbolically opaque. They cannot be fully grasped by collective categories. The Sophia Stage empath embodies this opacity. They do not fit neatly into roles of healer, victim, or guide. They may still serve these functions at times, but they are not defined by them. Their identity is no longer public property. This opacity invites projection of a different kind. Where once others projected need and dependency, they now project fear, envy, or hostility. The empath's calm is interpreted as judgment. Their silence is read as superiority. Their boundaries are seen as punishment. None of these interpretations are accurate. Yet, the empath no longer feels compelled to correct them. To do so would be to re-enter the old economy of explanation. Here lies another reason why most never reach this stage. It requires tolerating being misperceived without internalizing the misperception. This is extraordinarily difficult for a psyche trained to locate its value in relational harmony. Yet once achieved, it brings an immense freedom. The empath is no longer fragmented by others' opinions. Their inner image of themselves becomes more stable, less reactive. This stability does not eliminate suffering, but it changes its quality. Pain is no longer experienced as evidence of failure or lack. It is experienced as part of the human condition, neither sought nor avoided excessively. The empath learns to suffer consciously rather than unconsciously, and conscious suffering, though no less intense at times, does not erode the soul in the same way. What emerges gradually is a form of quiet joy. Though joy may not be the right word, it is more like inner rightness. Life feels aligned, even when difficult. Choices feel clean, even when costly. There is less regret, because actions arise from a deeper center. This inner rightness is sensed by others, even when they resent it. It cannot be argued with, only felt. It is important to say that the Sophia stage does not make the empath immune to loneliness. There are moments when the distance from the collective feels vast, old connections no longer resonate, and new ones have not yet formed. This liminal space can be painful, yet, unlike earlier loneliness, it is not experienced as abandonment. It is experienced as consequence. The psyche understands why the distance exists, even if the heart aches. Over time, new forms of connection do appear. They are fewer, quieter, and more mutual. These relationships are not based on emotional rescue or idealization. They are based on recognition. Each person stands in their own center. There is room to breathe. Such connections are not dramatic, but they are enduring. This is why the Sophia stage marks such a decisive turning point. The empath ceases to be organized around suffering, whether their own or others. They become organized around truth, and truth, in the psychological sense, is not an abstract principle. It is lived alignment between conscious attitude and unconscious reality. The danger, then, is not that the Sophia stage empath will harm others. It is that they will no longer protect others from themselves. They will not soften reality to make it palatable. They will not carry what does not belong to them. And in a world that relies heavily on emotional displacement, this refusal feels like an existential threat. Yet, from the perspective of the psyche, it is a necessary correction. Without it, individuation would remain incomplete, and empathy would remain a form of bondage. With it, empathy is transformed into wisdom, feeling is married to discernment, love is anchored in truth. The empath no longer disappears into the other, nor do they retreat from life. They stand where they are, fully present, no longer negotiable. This is the deeper meaning of Sophia, not enlightenment in the abstract, but embodiment. Wisdom that lives in the body, in choice, in silence, in timing. Wisdom that does not shout. Wisdom that does not convince. Wisdom that simply refuses to betray the self again. And once that refusal has taken root, the psyche does not return to its former innocence. Something has been seen, something has been integrated. The empath moves forward carrying less, yet being more. As this embodiment settles more deeply, the empath begins to encounter a final illusion that must dissolve. If Sophia is to fully incarnate the illusion that clarity must be shared in order to be real, in earlier stages, insight felt incomplete unless it was communicated, processed together, mirrored back. Understanding sought confirmation through dialogue. In Sophia, this need evaporates. Clarity stands on its own. The empath no longer feels compelled to translate inner truth into language that others can digest. Silence becomes not a defense, but a natural consequence of completion. I saw this repeatedly in those who had crossed far into individuation. They spoke less, not because they had nothing to say, but because what mattered no longer required articulation. Much suffering arises from speaking before one is finished inwardly. Sophia speaks only when the psyche is settled. This gives words a density that can be unsettling. They are fewer, but they land, and because they land, they cannot be easily dismissed. At this stage, something decisive happens in relation to the collective unconscious. The empath ceases to function as a shock absorber for the group. Families, workplaces, and intimate systems often rely unconsciously on one individual to carry emotional tension, to smooth conflict, to hold unspoken pain. When that individual steps out of this role, the system reacts as if gravity has shifted. Tension redistributes. Conflicts that were once diffused through the empath now surface directly between those who created them. This is why the Sophia Stage empath is often remembered as the one who changed everything. Even when they did nothing overt, their withdrawal reveals what was already present. They do not introduce chaos, they remove the buffer that concealed it. From the standpoint of the unconscious, this is an act of truth. From the standpoint of the system, it feels like sabotage. I wrote of this elsewhere, not as theory, but as fact. When one individual individuates, they disturb the collective equilibrium. This disturbance is not personal, it is archetypal. The collective prefers stability to truth, continuity to consciousness. Sophia represents a loyalty to the deeper order of the psyche rather than to surface harmony. And this loyalty is rarely rewarded in the short term. The empath at this stage often experiences a curious reversal, where once they felt overly responsible for others, now others attempt to make them responsible for the consequences of withdrawal. You changed, you became distant, you are no longer who you were. All of this is true, yet it is spoken as accusation rather than observation. The empath understands, often painfully, that what others mourn is not the person, but the function. This recognition cuts deeply because it forces the empath to grieve something that was never mutual. They realize that much of what felt like connection was actually reliance. This grief can be sharp, it may arrive unexpectedly, in moments of quiet, when the old urge to reach out resurfaces. Yet even here, Sophia does not regress. The empath allows the grief to pass through without acting on it. Feeling is permitted, compulsion is not. Here the psyche undergoes a subtle initiation. The empath learns to differentiate between love and longing. Longing seeks completion. Love recognizes wholeness. In the Sophia stage, longing loses its authority. The empath no longer pursues intensity for its own sake. They are not seduced by emotional highs or dramatic closeness. This often makes their relational life appear simpler, even quieter. But simplicity here is not impoverishment. It is refinement. Dreams during this phase may introduce images of guardianship. The dream ego stands watch rather than rushes forward. Gates appear that do not open automatically. The dreamer is not distressed by this. There is an understanding that timing matters. These images reflect a psyche that has accepted responsibility for its own thresholds. Not everything that asks for entry is allowed in. Not every emotion is acted upon. This discernment is the hallmark of Sophia. Most people associate empathy with permeability. Sophia reveals that true empathy requires containment. Without containment, feeling spills everywhere and becomes noise. With containment, feeling becomes signal. The Sophia Stage empath feels precisely because they are no longer flooded. They can attune without dissolving. This capacity often makes them sought after in times of crisis. Yet they do not rush to rescue. They respond when called, not when pulled. I have called this the difference between sacrificial empathy and conscious compassion. Sacrificial empathy erodes the self. Conscious compassion preserves it. The empath who reaches Sophia chooses when to give, when to listen, when to withdraw. This choice is not calculated. It is sensed. The body itself often knows before the mind. There is an internal yes and no that feels unmistakable. Following it brings peace. Violating it brings immediate dissonance. At this stage, even suffering takes on a different tone. When pain arises, it is no longer interpreted as a sign that something has gone wrong relationally. It is understood as part of the human condition, sometimes meaningful, sometimes simply real. The empath no longer rushes to extract lessons from every wound. Not everything must be turned into insight. Some experiences are meant to be lived and released. This marks a profound humility. Sophia does not seek mastery over life. She seeks alignment with it. The empath relinquishes the fantasy that awareness can control outcomes. They no longer believe that seeing clearly will prevent loss. Instead, they trust that seeing clearly allows loss to be integrated rather than resisted. This trust brings a quiet resilience that others sense but cannot easily emulate. It is here that envy often emerges most strongly, not because the empath is superior, but because they appear unburdened by the anxieties that dominate others' lives. They are less reactive, less desperate, less easily provoked. This can be deeply unsettling to those who rely on emotional intensity to feel alive. The empath's calm exposes how much energy is spent elsewhere on internal chaos. Yet, the Sophia Stage empath does not defend against envy. They do not attempt to reassure others of their harmlessness. To do so would be to misunderstand the nature of the transformation. They accept that individuation creates distance, and that distance creates misunderstanding. This acceptance is not resignation, it is maturity. Over time, the empath's life takes on a different rhythm. There is more space between events, more silence between thoughts. Decisions are made more slowly, but with greater finality. Regret diminishes. Because actions are less reactive, even mistakes feel cleaner, easier to own and integrate. The psyche is no longer split between inner knowing and outer behavior. This is the quiet power of Sophia, not dominance, not control, not detachment, but coherence. The empath becomes a coherent person, and coherence, in a fragmented world, is deeply disruptive. It cannot be argued with, it cannot be manipulated, it simply stands. This standing is what most empaths fear unconsciously from the beginning, to stand alone, without justification, without explanation, without being mirrored back as good or necessary. Yet it is precisely this standing that completes the journey. The empath no longer needs to be seen as kind to be kind, nor to be needed to have value. Their worth is no longer relationally negotiated. From this place, life continues much as before on the surface. Work is done, relationships are maintained, obligations are met, but the inner posture has shifted irrevocably. The empath no longer bends toward every call. They listen inward first, and when they do move toward another, it is freely, without debt or depletion. This is why the Sophia stage is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with revelation or bliss. It unfolds quietly, almost invisibly, yet once established, it cannot be undone. The psyche has learned something essential about itself. It has learned where it ends and where the other begins. And with this knowledge, empathy is finally liberated from sacrifice and becomes wisdom in action. What remains beyond this point is not another role, but a way of being. The empath lives less in reaction and more in response, less in story and more in presence, less in fear of loss and more in fidelity to inner truth. And though this way of being may never be widely understood, it carries a depth of peace that no earlier stage could offer. This is the silent authority of Sophia. When this silent authority has fully taken root, the psyche enters a phase that is rarely spoken about, because it offers little that can be dramatized or displayed. It is the phase in which the empath no longer measures their life by intensity, insight, or transformation, but by truthfulness of alignment. Nothing spectacular occurs, and yet everything essential has already changed. The soul is no longer in negotiation with itself. At this point, the empath discovers something quietly astonishing. Much of what once felt urgent was never essential. The endless inner dialogues, the rehearsed explanations, the imagined confrontations, the anticipatory guilt, all of these begin to fall silent, not because the world has become easier, but because the psyche has ceased to argue against reality. What is accepted no longer demands justification. What is known no longer seeks defense. I observed that those who reach this depth often struggle to speak about it. Language belongs to differentiation, to contrast, to comparison, but Sophia lives beyond comparison. She does not measure herself against others, nor does she need to position herself within narratives of growth or healing. The empath is no longer preoccupied with where they are on a path. They are on the ground of their life, and that is sufficient. This is also where a final misunderstanding must dissolve the belief that wisdom removes vulnerability. It does not. The Sophia stage empath still feels pain, still loves, still risks disappointment. What has changed is not the presence of vulnerability, but its meaning. Vulnerability is no longer a debt offered to secure connection. It is simply part of being alive. The empath no longer exposes themselves in order to be met. They expose themselves only when it is true. Here, compassion reaches its most refined form. It is no longer compelled by identification. The empath does not say, "I know how you feel." As a reflex, they listen without merging, they witness without absorbing. This allows the other to remain sovereign in their own suffering. It is a profound respect that may feel, to the uninitiated, like distance. In truth, it is the opposite of intrusion. Again and again, I saw how this respect transformed encounters. People either rose to meet it or retreated from it. Those who were willing to carry their own psychic weight found the empath's presence stabilizing. Those who sought to be carried felt exposed, even abandoned. The empath did not choose these outcomes. They simply ceased to interfere with them. At this depth, even the notion of being an empath loses its importance. Labels fall away. Identity simplifies. The individual no longer needs a name for what they are. They live from a center that does not require description. This can feel strangely anonymous, especially to those who once derived meaning from being special, gifted, or different. Yet, anonymity here is not erasure. It is freedom from performance. Dreams now often grow sparse, or they become strikingly simple. A single image, a quiet gesture, a sense of presence without narrative. The unconscious no longer needs to compensate loudly, because the conscious attitude has become aligned. Where once the psyche shouted through symbols, it now whispers or remains silent. This silence is not emptiness, it is equilibrium. I have called this elsewhere a reconciliation between the ego and the self, not a fusion, but a cooperation. The ego no longer tries to manage life according to ideals, nor does it resist the demands of reality. It responds, and in this response, there is a dignity that cannot be borrowed or bestowed. It arises from fidelity to what is inwardly known. This fidelity has consequences that extend beyond the individual. Without intending to, the Sophia Stage empath alters the psychic atmosphere around them. Conversations slow down. Emotional exaggeration feels out of place. Certain behaviors no longer gain traction, not because they are confronted, but because they find no resonance. The empath has become a tuning fork set to a different frequency. Some find this deeply relieving, others find it intolerable. There is no way to predict who will respond, in which way. The empath learns to accept this without judgment. Acceptance here does not mean approval, it means non-interference. Each psyche must find its own equilibrium. This is also where forgiveness takes on a new meaning. Forgiveness is no longer an act performed for moral reasons or relational repair. It becomes a natural byproduct of understanding. When one sees clearly, resentment loses its fuel, not because harm was insignificant, but because it no longer defines the present. The empath does not forget, but memory no longer governs reaction. Yet this clarity does not lead to passivity. On the contrary, action becomes cleaner. When the empath acts, it is without inner division. There is no hidden hope for recognition, no fear of retaliation, no covert self-betrayal. Even difficult actions feel strangely peaceful. The psyche stands behind them fully. This is the final paradox of the Sophia Stage. The empath becomes both less involved and more responsible. Less involved emotionally in what does not belong to them, more responsible for their own truth. They no longer confuse responsibility for others with responsibility to themselves. Each is given its proper place. Most will never reach this point because it offers no spectacle. There is nothing to display, nothing to teach in formulas, nothing to market. It is lived quietly, often invisibly, yet those who encounter it feel its weight. They sense a person who is no longer searching, no longer bargaining, no longer asking to be met halfway. This is why the most dangerous empath is not the wounded one, nor the awakening one, but the integrated one, the one who has withdrawn projections, reclaimed authority, and accepted the cost of truth. Such a person cannot be pulled back into unconscious roles. They cannot be flattered into self-betrayal. They cannot be shamed into explaining themselves away. They walk through life carrying less psychic noise, less borrowed emotion, less unfinished business. What remains is presence, and presence, when it is grounded and undivided, is profoundly unsettling to a world organized around distraction and displacement. Sophia does not conquer, she does not persuade, she does not demand allegiance. She simply stands as a fact of the psyche, and once she stands, the empath no longer needs to be dangerous in any dramatic sense. Their danger lies in their refusal to lie to themselves again. This is the quiet culmination of the empath's journey, not transcendence, not perfection, but truth lived without apology. The empath has reached a place where they no longer disappear into others, nor retreat from life. They remain where they are, fully present, answerable only to the deeper order that first called them inward. And from this place, life continues, not louder, not easier, but real.